Welcome to First Builders, the podcast for those who shape companies from the ground up. I'm Amber Illig, founder and general partner at the Council Capital, where we invest in early teams solving critical problems in essential industries.
And I'm Rachel Choi, partner at the Council. We love highlighting builders whose careers don't follow a straight line and instead compound across very different chapters.
Today's guest has been in the room during some of the most consequential scaling moments in modern tech, from global messaging to social media governance to privacy at scale.
We're joined today by Hwang, head of legal at Class Dojo, a company reimagining communication and trust between teachers, students, and families.
Now, Tina has been inside of the biggest blockbuster companies of the last 2 decades. Google when it was becoming the internet's operating system, WhatsApp during its growth to over 10 billion users, Twitter when Elon Musk walked in the door, and Ancestry, sitting atop one of the largest DNA databases in the world. She's seen what it looks like to build from the inside of companies, reshaping how the world communicates, remembers, and connects. And she's lived through enough plot twists to fill an entire season of television.
Tina has spent her career building legal and governance systems during high growth and high stakes moments where product velocity, regulatory scrutiny, and global trust collide.
Tina, we're so excited to have you here. Welcome to First Builders.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the intro. You definitely made me seem more polished and more connected than I truly am. But it's truly been an honor and privilege to have worked at some of these companies and to have been there when they've reached these hypergrowth stages. It's been very exciting, sometimes chaotic, but it is what makes us First Builders tick in an unusual way.
Totally. Yeah. And just building on that, I mean, you've repeatedly joined companies during those inflection points. You know, WhatsApp was scaling payments and enterprise, Twitter during platform volatility, and now Class Dojo at an earlier stage. What sort of draws you to these moments of structural change?
You know, I was trying to think about that as I was thinking about this podcast of, why is it that I seem drawn to these first builder kind of emerging, growing business opportunities? Am I just a masochist at the end of the day? And I want to be under under the gun. I think it really is about the opportunity to take in a bunch of ambiguity, but then also be able to create a vision and a strategy and then be able to execute. And so I think it's that package which makes these experiences attractive and great for someone like me, is that the road it's not clear. And that ambiguity draws me in, and the opportunity to sort of develop the path forward and to build that path is really attractive as well.
Yeah, there's no growth without lack of comfort.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. And you're definitely thrown into that. And I can imagine being on the legal side of things. It can feel even more chaotic, right? Because people are operating so quickly. And, I feel like oftentimes a lot of teams will see legal as kind of like a blocker a little bit, right? Like to being able to move quickly, but it's really important, right? When you have hypergrowth companies. And when did you, I guess, first realize that legal could really shape the product and strategy rather than just constrain it and make sure things don't go wrong?
Yeah, it's such a great question because I feel like, there are a lot of companies where they haven't really gotten to that point where they feel like legal and regulatory strategy should be part of the actual business strategy. And they hit a friction point and they discover very rudely that they are impacted by regulation, whether it's local regulation or more sweeping content regulation. And they suddenly have to hit a hurdle and they're in reactive mode. And so I think businesses that are traditionally in semi-regulated and quasi-regulated spaces, like the businesses that you both have been in, health and also autonomous vehicles, they kind of have to get it right up front in terms of legal strategy is very much part of the business strategy because you're already operating in this regulated environment where that every single decision is going to be impacted by regulation and what you can do in a particular country or area. And so you might as well proactively address it and figure out a path forward. And that will enable sort of the hypergrowth rather than a stumbling block at the very end in terms of, oh no, what do we do? And so I think when you get to these businesses that are in these moments where they feel like, whoa, we're in this quasi regulated space, or now in a full regulated space, that's where I think the business itself has this sudden realization of, wait a minute, we can be proactive here. This can very much be part of our growth strategy. And the more we can do it proactively, the better off we are going to be.
Yeah. I love how you view it as like legal, like taking into account legal early on can be an accelerator versus a detractor. It can actually, open the door up to more revenue streams rather than close the door to growth. So I think a lot of like founders at the early stages might not be realizing that. And I think it's important to kind of look around the corner and see where the company is heading to know when it's time to bring somebody like you into the fold.
Yeah. And I would argue the most successful businesses that survive through the long term, they get that sooner rather than
Mhm.
later, because they're not just operating for the next 6 months or the next 12 months. They're really thinking about what's going to be my business for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and thinking about that proactively upfront. And I think as the world is more global, it becomes table stakes. If you want to be a global business, you really have to start thinking about it, because guess what? The governments in India, the governments in Brazil, the governments even in Europe, they don't want tech companies to just come in and barge their way in. They very much want businesses to acknowledge the regulatory regime, comply, show the respect to local law, and grow in a principled way according to their laws.
Yeah, totally. And just also building on that, like at WhatsApp, you were there during its expansion beyond the consumer messaging that everybody knows it for into business and payments. And that's a massive shift internally in regulatory surface areas. So what did that sort of chapter teach you about building that infrastructure earlier before that pressure hits?
It's such a great example where regulation intersected with business strategy, and it had to be very much legal strategy had to be very much part of the design strategy, like we talked about in the beginning. And so, WhatsApp is one of those rare businesses, and I so appreciate my experience there, where our top markets are actually global first, and they're not actually in the US. And so to think about expansion for WhatsApp was to think about, wait a minute, what do the regulators in India care about? What do the regulators in Brazil care about? What about in Europe? And if you're thinking global first, you develop this mindset of, very much so, we need to consider the local government relation, the regulatory regime, and then also the headwinds that are coming, and understanding how those might change in a given day. A good example was our WhatsApp payments journey. We very much thought we had a product that we that would benefit users, and that the folks on the ground would really want. But it took a lot of planning with local public policy experts, as well as a lot of conversations with local government in order to make it happen. And so again, when you're in that global framework, I think you're trained and you're honed to have that sense of, this is not just going to be a pure, let's launch, let's iterate, let's grow. It's going to be a more complicated journey of, how do you marry all of these frameworks and all of the policy issues together in a cohesive way to enable the growth that you want.
Yeah, I mean, that seems wild because payments is a total beast in its own right. So all of a sudden, it's like a consumer messaging platform that's also a fintech platform, and also just unique that you're doing that at like billions of users rather than like launching a new company and going like market by market and figuring out what works before you go to the next. So I'm sure there was a little bit of staging, but still, it's a lot of users and geographies to consider at once.
Yeah.
It is. And again, in a normal consumer business, I think founders and other folks would probably gravitate towards, hey, like, I have a consumer product that folks would want. Like, what is the holdup? But again, against that backdrop of what we've been discussing, to do it at that scale, to do it across geos, it takes that thoughtful preparation of all those different work streams to make sure it's successful.
Yeah. Was there anything kind of like surprising in that when you had to work with like these different geographies that maybe like people that are building in the US right now maybe just like not taking into consideration?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that we have in the US sort of a mindset still, I think so, that, good tech will win all. If I can develop the best tech, that will win at the end of the day. And I think what is surprising is that that only wins to a certain extent against this global context, because I do feel that, through my experiences, that the global stage and how to grow globally is very much about good tech. Don't get me wrong, good tech. You need good tech. You need innovation. You need the right product. But it is also deeply political and deeply tied to how are you going to convince governments and users in these other countries that not only that you have good tech, but you have the tech that they should trust and that they should open up their markets to. And so I think we still have this mindset sometimes, that, well, I have the best product. What's the big deal? Like, this should be fine. But I think that global stage, it's a little bit more nuanced because of the policy considerations. And it's almost as if you have to think about, well, it's not just you have the best tech, but you're being invited into the home of another, if you want to call it that way. And when you're being invited into the home of the other, you need to establish a level of trust before people will greet you warmly and embrace you in the way that you want to be embraced. And so I think
Yeah.
it's that package, maybe, Rachel, that I would say that was surprising to me, because I also came from that mindset. I'm like, good tech should
Yeah.
win all. Like, what's the problem?
Was there anything in particular, like, was there an example of something to build that trust that you guys had to do? Maybe you could keep the country or the,
Yeah.
location anonymous, but yeah, would love to hear kind of an example of that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we all kind of understand that cultural norms are different. So I think what it takes to be invited into somebody's home to create that safe type of atmosphere is very different from country to country based upon cultural norms too. So you can imagine, from the way that you communicate about your product, that needs to be tweaked for the market that you're planning for, all the way to, your terms and conditions and how you present them, and also, how you think about the UX messaging in terms of particular features, your default controls, perhaps even, not just from a regulatory standpoint, but wait, culturally, do people expect that this is a default on versus default off control? All these things, I think, come in a package of how do you create that sense of trust with a particular user? And so all the way from messaging, UX, to controls and settings, I think that those are the things that someone should think about when they're trying to adapt to a particular market.
Yeah, makes
Sounds like a
sense.
good exercise in humility, which is not something that a lot of tech companies have. So it's helpful.
Yeah, I wouldn't say even, yeah, I mean, humility. And also, I think that, again, like I come from the 2000 tech boom, right? And I think there was just an ethos of,
Mm.
the best tech will win. And I just don't think that that is 100% true right now, particularly in terms of a global expansion.
And now you've chosen to go back to an earlier stage company with Class Dojo. So, after operating at massive global scale, what felt attractive to going earlier again, even after that experience?
Yeah, again, I was trying to reflect on this. Again, I was like, wait, what?
Why do I do this to myself?
Amber and
Yeah.
Amber and Rachel are hitting upon something. Why do I keep doing this? I think it is really the attractiveness of building and scaling and doing it in a area that I really actually didn't have a lot of familiarity with in terms of ed tech. But when you think about sectors that have great social impact, if you can bring about that innovation and change, you think about education, you think about climate, you think about healthcare, think about, financial systems as well. Could I bring my expertise in terms of building and scaling and growth for a company that was trying to innovate in one of these impactful spaces? And I think that was really the attractiveness in being able to help my management team really kind of think through some issues in terms of regulatory frameworks, building a program, building good governance structures. And so it's another one of those opportunities where, the ambiguity attracted me, and then also the opportunity to kind of build it in the way that I thought, hey, like this could really work. And if I can make it work, it can have tremendous impact for not just the company, but for kind of the community at large in terms of what Class Dojo tries to do in terms of serving parents, teachers, and children across the world.
Yeah, that's awesome. And for our listeners who may not be as aware of Class Dojo, can you share just a little bit about what that company does?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So our mission is to give every kid on earth the education that they love. It actually was started by two founders from the UK, so very much with the global mindset. One of whom, our CEO, was a former teacher and very much had that hands-on experience of what worked and what didn't work in the classroom. And it started out as a classroom club for teachers to be able to communicate with parents and kids and to be able to keep parents informed with what's going on in the classroom. And now it's really blossomed into kind of a service that not only helps the parent in keeping up with what's the classroom, but also with all the other educational opportunities for them outside of the classroom. So we also offer more businesses in terms of tutoring, and we have a game. We also have a reading tutor, and then we also have a premium service that allows the parents to organize the material in a better way. And so, really it's become sort of a service that helps a parent with all of the educational opportunities for their child.
It's awesome. And just speaking of sort of the impact of your work, like you've worked on products that touch billions of people, whether it's messaging, education, identity, family data. And at scale, trust is not really just a brand attribute, it's infrastructure. So I'd love to hear, like, throughout all these experiences from early Google to, Twitter to WhatsApp to Ancestry to Class Dojo, how do you operationalize trust? And what's an example of when you've done that?
It's such a great question. And I know both of you probably have had to think about the same similar things and in your
Yeah,
roles
absolutely.
at your various companies, because I think when you operate in a heavy consumer business, user trust it's a product decision almost. Like you have to factor it into the actual design of the product such that every rollout it scales with it. And I think really what I try to do as a legal leader is I try to bring that ethos to the team that I'm working with, which is, I'm going to give you the legal framework, but very much this is about the trust framework and really what levers can we pull together to bring forward that trusted app, that trusted service. And so, what I'm going to talk about is one component, but really as a leadership team, we should be bringing in all these other components so that the goal at the end of the day, our common goal, is to design and build our product with scale. And so sometimes it's about setting the legal framework and then layering on principles and helping a management team think through kind of those user trust principles that they want to layer on top of the legal framework. Other times it's more about facilitating the right conversations. If it's not time for a framework, maybe it's just about having the right conversations about here's the legal bar, but what really do we want to commit to as a company to create this atmosphere of trust? Like, you know, maybe the course example is like, well, the law says we have to honor XYZ in terms of refunds. We don't feel like that's not just like to us. We actually want to go above and beyond that. And I think Amazon's been a great example where the Amazon refund process is amazing. As a consumer on my end, I feel like they go above and beyond
Yeah, that's what keeps me
in
coming back. You just know it's gonna be less headache.
Yeah.
exactly. And making sure that they honor my refund, they process it quickly, it's almost
Yeah.
instantaneous. That's not about the law. That's really about what they wanted to commit to as a
Mm.
company to user trust and bringing you back as a consumer day in and day out. And guess what? I will pay them the $150 or whatever they're charging now for Amazon Prime every year because of that trust. And I'm not going to go anywhere else because I know I get great customer service. And so again, sometimes it's about framework. Other times it's just having those conversations and being able to nudge the thinking along. And I think other times it's about in the moment of the big decision, really articulating and helping that leadership team articulate what are the principles you want to stand for as a company, and helping navigate that conversation in the context of a big decision.
Yeah, that's super interesting when you talk about like really the principles beyond, I think almost like the legal aspect is like the floor essentially. And then it's like building on top of that. Because I was curious when you're at Ancestry, right? Like you were the chief privacy officer. And of course, genetic data, it's super sensitive. It's probably as sensitive as most of the other data that you can think about. So how did you kind of have that conversation there? What do you even think about like right now, since there's so many of these like consumer health companies, like, there's Aura, I'm wearing my
Yeah,
Aura ring. There
right.
is Superpower, Function Health that have all of these, like they have a lot of labs data and clinical data from people as well. And then of course, ChatGPT Health and Anthropic Health. So yeah, so I'd be curious about kind of like your just perspective on that and your opinion on that as well, and what companies are doing well there and what companies you think should be setting like a higher bar.
Yeah, I will say I was very lucky at Ancestry. I kind of inherited a great foundation from the former chief privacy officer, who spotted very early on that so much of this space was not just about, again, what is the legal answer, but really charting out a path forward in terms of a framework for the entire industry. And so what he championed was basically a coalition across companies in this space and consumer health space that would champion model legislation that articulated the principles of by which users could trust services like this. So
Wait,
a
and sorry,
consent framework.
what's model legislation? I'm not sure if I understood that.
Yeah. No worries at all. No worries at all. So this would just be legislation that our my government affairs lead, who would introduce in various states, as if we want to consider privacy legislation in this space, this is where we should start from. This is the model of what
Okay, okay.
we should start from.
Got
So
it.
I think these companies should very much be thinking in this way of like, not only what is the current state of today, like what are all the laws that apply today, but really thinking forward and championing industry setting frameworks that protect users all around, because that is actually like a win-win for the business and for consumers as well, because the business gets to advance the framework that they feel like it makes the right trade-offs, and the users benefit because now there are common protections across for a particular set of health data. And so really, again, I benefited in Ancestry from all of this groundwork, but that would be my hope for the continual consumer health data industry, is that the industry themselves come up with frameworks and principles by which they were going to operate to keep consumer trust. And so when that happens, I think that's when it actually really benefits both the business side and the user side, because there's almost like an self-governing industry momentum to adhere to a common set of principles. No one's trying to cut corners. You're always going to have folks who want to, maybe cut corners, but for the most part, if the industry can align, this is this is by the standards by which we will operate, you end up in that win-win situation.
Yep.
Yeah, makes
Um,
sense.
yeah, and just related to cutting corners, there's always this tension between like speed and safety. And founders often say, we'll fix governance later, let's just get it done. So in your experience, what is that line where it can become a fatal mistake for a company to kind of put it off?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because I think good legal strategy is actually not, mitigating every risk up front. That's actually
Yeah,
not
it could
possible,
be
and
crippling.
also, yeah, not conducive to actual good business strategy. I think the best companies that I've seen do this is really thinking about reasoned business trade-offs and always coming up with reasoned sort of business outcome versus the legal risks that they're taking on. So legal risks for just legal risk's sake, I would say, is never a no, no, never a good strategy long term. Really, what you want to develop is a model by which you can really analyze the risk you're taking on versus the business impact that you're going to get, and be able to make good reasoned decisions about why you're doing something. I think when you just take on risk for the sake of taking on risk without understanding whether you're going to get any real business trade-off or business impact, that's where companies, I think, get into trouble with deferring governance too long, deferring certain things too long, because they're in this mindset of, I don't need it, I'll just address it later, without really
Yeah.
understanding the other side of the equation. It's almost like you understand one side, but you don't understand the other side, and you keep on making the same decision without understanding both sides. So I think that's the pitfall of deferring things too long, is when you don't have those reasoned conversations about upside versus downside. If you have a framework of upside versus downside, guess what? Everyone walks away with a good, not what the outcome maybe they wanted, but everybody walks away with at least the feeling of, okay, we understood here. We understood what
Yeah.
we were trading off against.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about trade-offs because that's actually a really common debate on the consumer health care data side of things that people will talk about. Like, obviously, there's one side of things where, hey, all healthcare data should be completely locked up. It's safest if only the people who have access to it. It's like, walled gardens, all of that, right? So that you don't really get like that interoperability. Then on the other side is, well, let's let everyone be able to have access to it because then you can do research on it. You can actually learn from it. You can make advances in things like drug discovery as well, right? Because of the more data you have. And so it's just interesting. Like there's things that there's always like these trade-offs that people are trying to like really walk the line on. And especially where you sit on the legal side, I'm sure it's fascinating debates back and forth always on trade-offs.
I think that's the fun of being legal counsel or in-house legal counsel, is to have that back and forth. There's often one answer, basically, that it doesn't, like one extreme doesn't necessarily lead you to the right outcome, or another extreme of like no interoperability whatsoever or full interoperability. It's rarely
Yeah.
those answers, right? It's really also the answers in the middle of like, where is interoperability important from a business perspective? How do we give users trust, consent, control over how we interoperate? How do we make sure that that framework is compliant with law? How do we evangelize our position of why this should be the law if it's not the law currently? And here's why. Like, here's why, as a trusted framework, we think that this is the middle answer is the right thing to do, and these are the right set of controls for the user.
Yep. Yeah. And here's a slightly spicy one. We kind of touched on it earlier, but
Okay, I love
yeah.
spiciness.
Well, in hypergrowth tech, we'll see how spicy it is. Legal tech, or just legal in general, is often seen as kind of the department of no. Do you think that's true?
Well, I mean, I'm biased, of course. Here's my honest answer. I think that yes. I mean, I think that is a critique of some legal teams, some lawyers, and I think that it's very easy to fall back into a position of, well, that's not compliant. That's not 100% compliant, or that's not right. And so I think that gets interpreted as a no. I think the key to being a really good in-house counsel is taking that no, but finding a path forward, delivering on options, and having the conversations like the one that, Rachel talked about, of like, it's never these both extremes. Like, what are the middle options by which we can consider? And and so I don't think legal teams are departments of no, but I do think oftentimes those conversations don't happen, or they happen too late. And so I think the experience, of all parties would be like, well, legal just said no. Really, to me, it's just a sign that the right conversations haven't happened in the right way at the right time, and we haven't spent enough time iterating on the options in the middle. and really figuring out a path forward. Now, don't get me wrong. There are times when things are clearly illegal, would cause criminal penalty, and I would not advise someone to go forward. But most 99% of the time, it's those conversations in the middle and about the trade-off conversations and outlining the options in the middle.
Yeah. By the way, like I wanted to put you on the spot, but I totally agree because I've worked at different companies and sometimes it is the Department of No, but I think particularly at companies that I've seen growing fast, there is typically a legal partner that is more of a co-creator and like they kind of let you know what the boundaries are and understand what the business need is and why it's so important or not that important at all. I think even Cecilia Zaniti, who we both know at GCAI, I got the chance to work with her at Cruise, and that was something that stuck out to me just over the years. I was like, wow, this is the most like unique experience I've had working with a legal partner and sort of a top general counsel type person because they're organizing things into frameworks, they're informing discussions so that if things do go south, everybody agreed, everybody was holding hands together, and there was like a reason why the company was willing to take that risk or not. So I guess just kind of building on that, like, during times of mass product evolution, which you've seen many times, how do you decide what risk is sort of strategic versus reckless?
Yeah, it's a great question because I feel like you could sneeze and you hit into a regulation or you hit into a law. It is a very thorny world out there with state laws, federal laws, global laws, and that's part of the art. I always like to kind of talk about my practice is part of it is science, right? Like part of it is, yes, understanding the law, understanding what's happening. But then the other part is more of an art and it's more of a judgment of what's important and what's not. And, that comes through experience. And so it comes through like living through tough times, like we have talked about, and experiencing when things don't go right, and learning from them, and also what works when things go the right way. And the other part of it is also judgment in terms of being able to kind of read the tea leaves in terms of enforcement, likelihood, probability of enforcement, what the regulatory trends are, where the geopolitical climate is. And so, for me, that prioritization exercise, there's a science to it, of like what regulation, what geos, how much of a risk, what are the penalties, but then there's an art to it that is about honing that judgment of, is this important? And that's based upon experience. And then also kind of, I would say like almost a reading of the tea leaves type exercise of based upon all the things that I'm seeing and hearing. And this is what I view as the most important risk to take on. And then again, that takes your ear to the ground. It takes, conversations with experts, and staying close to your different communities, staying close to policy trends as well. And that's, it was so funny. Like I was reading an article by a GC and he's like, well, a lot of people ask me like, how do I become a GC? And one of his first words of wisdom was, you got to fail a lot. You got to fail a lot. And you got to make a lot of mistakes because it's that making a lot of mistakes that gives you judgment of what works and what doesn't. And then he's like, well, and the second piece of it is like, you got to know a lot. You got to live a little and you got to like know sort of, what's going on in your space and what's going around in the world because you're bringing that all together in terms of that second piece of it, the art piece of it. And so I know it's not a very rigorous answer to your question, Amber, but I think it's really those two elements of it, the scientific quantification component of it, but then also that judgment and that art layer that helps me develop the priorities.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess it's my turn for a spicy question. But I don't know if you heard of this book coming out last year called Careless People.
Yes.
So I didn't know if you had read it or like at least like read some of the news things on it. But I was curious like what your perspective was, especially since you were at WhatsApp, which obviously was, not it was a subsidiary or part of Meta as well. But yeah, curious if you had felt or seen any of that and how did that kind of like affect what you did when you were at WhatsApp or how you affected it
It's so
afterwards?
funny. I was actually on another podcast where I actually recommended everyone go read or listen to Careless
Okay, we'll
People.
add it to our show notes.
Yeah,
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 I
yeah.
haven't read
Well,
it yet.
not I would say it's worth a read and listen. Not so much that I think that, this is what I experienced or this is what 100% happened. Like you said, Rachel, I don't have a lot of familiarity with what really happened because I was working in another part of the company. But I think it's a great lesson in terms of what we opened up this podcast on, which is, I think in the early 2000s, we just definitely had this mindset that it's about the innovation, it's about the tech, it's about the growth. And I think there was an underappreciation of the geopolitical environment and the geopolitical impact that technology could have. And so I think it's a great book to really kind of drive home the impact of tech outside of just pure innovation and how it makes life better, that there is this overall geopolitical impact that sometimes is unpredictable and maybe even not even understandable by the people who develop the tech, and is surprising and is confusing, and but at the same time it is very much part of that trust aspect that we talked about early on. And so
Totally.
it is a reality that tech, when it grows to, a certain level, it has that impact. And how do you deal with that impact? And how are you as a corporation accountable and responsible for that impact? Because regardless of whether you wanted it or not, it's out there.
Yes.
And it's very important that in order for you to keep user trust, that you address it. And so I think it's a great
Yeah.
book to really highlight how tech morphs in that way, and then how it can grow into that area where you all of a sudden are saddled with geopolitical responsibilities that you never
Totally.
even thought you would have in the first place.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
totally.
think
I
it's
think that
extremely well, I was just gonna say, I think it's extremely timely right now. Like, just it feels like we're going through another wave right now. And Rachel and I travel all over the United States, meeting with founders and LPs, and building out our portfolio for our funds. And it's sort of like a different tone that you hear across the country than this bubble that we're in Silicon Valley. Like, we go to an event any night of the week in Silicon Valley, and we hear like AI is taking over the world. Let's put as much capital toward it as possible. Yes, let's reduce. We could do this with 300 people instead of 3,000 people. Let's
Yeah.
slice jobs. Let's do this and that. AI is going to be so powerful. Maybe it'll become conscious. I mean, like, it's on another level. And then you go to like another place like Bentonville, Arkansas, where I was recently, or Atlanta, where Rachel was recently.
Yeah.
And they're still like, ooh, we don't know about self-driving cars. I can't believe you would take that instead of an Uber.
yeah.
And then, I went to the dinner in Bentonville, and a big topic around the table with industry leaders there in essential industries was, we're worried about like safety with AI. We are worried about AI taking everybody's jobs. There's really it's like AI has a PR problem right now, and an impact and a PR problem where, people across the US don't want to hear about how it's going to take over all their jobs and there's
Right.
no path for them moving forward. They want to understand why they should be excited about this technology. So I
Yeah.
think a lot of early stage founders need to be thinking about, how do I paint a world with my technology in it that is exciting for policymakers, for people, for businesses, and that isn't just like get on board or remain part of the permanent underclass, which is what you see sometimes in these circles
Yeah.
that feel more like a rat race. So that's
Not
my
just
little
in the
plug.
cer yeah, even in the billboards around the
Yeah.
city, you're like, "Oh, like, do everything with AI. You don't need to hire people." Like, it actually said, like, "No humans," or something, like, the
Oh,
fact
I
that,
think
like
I've seen that one. It's like
yeah.
right near the
Lighting things
bridge.
up's exciting
Yes,
for
right
people.
near the bridge, and
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
exciting if it's like, "Oh, it's, there's no humans that need to be involved in this." And so, maybe here, like, some folks might, think that's exciting, but, like, definitely not, like, outside the Silicon Valley bubble for sure.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that I think the folks who can get this early on, and I think this is why I love the thesis of the council, and not to plug the council too much, but I love the thesis of the council and what we focus on in a fund in terms of finding people who have been operators and first builders, because I think they've kind of seen that kind of that unless you build that trust of keeping the user coming back to you again and again and again, guess what? The next cheapest version of whatever it is that you're giving them, they will go and they will throw their money that way. Like, there is no brand loyalty unless you develop that trust and can really develop that narrative to keep your user coming back to you again and again and again, regardless of, whether there's always going to be someone starting up and undercutting you on cost or undercutting you on the package that you're offering. But if you can develop that user trust and keep that user trust and that narrative, that's how you're going to build a sustainable business and keep growing. Again, I go back to my example of Amazon. By the way, I do not work for I never worked for Amazon, and I don't have any.
You're a very happy consumer.
I'm a very happy consumer.
Yeah, a very happy
I
consumer.
bet there are cheaper subscription plans that I can buy to get, what I need for my essentials. But the customer service and the brand, the trust that they've earned with me, guess what? I'm gonna keep going back to them. Yes, of course, there's a tipping point by which, I would say, like, this is not worth it. But I do think that somehow we've kind of lost the pendulum on that a bit. I agree with you, Amber. I think we've been so fascinated by the tech that we have kind of lost the narrative on user value. And I'm hoping the pendulum swings back the other direction, because I actually think that's the way you get to the right result, both from a legal regulatory perspective, as well as from the user perspective, and also from the company perspective, because then they can also really hone in on what principles they want to stand for as they develop in this space.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, we're going to hop over to our rapid fire playbook. So we're going to ask you a series of questions.
Yeah.
Just say the first thing on your mind, and I will let Amber kick it off.
Cool. What do you think is the most underrated skill for a first builder?
I think it's the ability to make decisions when there are ambiguous circumstances. I think it's easy to build when things are clear. It's hard to build when things are unclear. And how do you know when to pull the trigger and why? Again, not necessarily a scientific skill, but it takes an art of decision, being able to make the decision when the circumstances aren't clear.
What's one habit that helped you stay steady during all of this high growth chaos?
One of the things that I love to do at the end of the week is just kind of reflect on the week of, hey, what went well and what didn't go well. And so I try to carve out time every Friday afternoon for that. And I think that really helps me kind of reflect on, hey, there's some things that went well this week, and there's some things that didn't. And what do I need to pivot on for the following week? And so I think when you're in the midst of growth, it's easy to jump from one thing to the other, but to carve out intentional reflection time of what worked well, what didn't work well. I think that's another skill set I would recommend. It's carving out that time, because you want to be able to make adjustments as you go, because not everything is going to go to plan.
And then what's a lesson from WhatsApp that still shapes your thinking?
It's so funny. Our founder used to say, focus is the F word. When I first got there, I was like, what? What is he talking about? And as we kind of went through these periods of launching WhatsApp payments, the API, building the business API, growing the consumer business from $1 billion to 10 billion. I could have understood his ethos, which is, unless you focus, you're never going to get the clarity you need to do any of these things well. I think it was just his way of, and it's kind of a joking way, but also his way of really holding all of us to operational excellence and really kind of wanting us to be able to have that space to deliver that excellence. And so I say this all the time sometimes to the teams that I manage, is like, it's okay. It's like, focus is the F word. Like, like it's fine if we need to say no to a couple things in order to really, really deliver on what we need to deliver. But sometimes there's just that, there's that fear of like, wait, but I can't get to this or can't get to that. But sometimes it's exactly what is needed for you to deliver what's what's operationally excellent for what you're building.
Yeah, love that one.
And then what's one belief that you hold strongly about building in regulated industries, which I have I feel like I might know, but would love to hear.
I would say that regulation it's not a lot of people think of it as a constraint, but actually it can actually be a foundation to building that user trust first design that we've talked about continually through this podcast. That, I think we all gravitate towards that, where if you can start from regulation as an input and not think of it as a constraint, it can actually make your product stronger and more defensible in the long run. And it can also provide you with the framework for building that user trust narrative that will keep your customers coming back to you again and again and again. So that's kind of my soapbox on building in regulatory environments, is think of it as an input, not a constraint.
And then what is one thing that you used to believe about leadership that you no longer do?
Great question. I think I used to think that, as a leader, again, I had to have all the answers. Someone asked me a question, I would be the, one who in the room that would know. And I definitely have learned and no longer believe that it's really, leadership is not about having all the answers. It's actually empowering the people around you to have the answers and creating the right context so that the right conversations and the right decisions are happening even
Right.
without you in the room. I think that's the most fulfilling part of leadership and mentorship for me. Is it's really not about having the answers and driving a lot of top-down decisions. It's really about empowering people and giving people the right context so that they can make actually the right calls themselves.
Yeah. No, totally. I feel like Amber and I, we've always lived with really, sometimes we had probably poor managers and sometimes we had really great leaders. And it's always the great leaders that gave us that level of autonomy and being able to stretch beyond our role. I think that has really pushed us further along as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and I bet your teams probably to this day, like they appreciate you for that. I feel like, that's also what builds long-term relationships with the
Oh yeah.
people that you build teams around, which is like, I mean, you're not there to tell them what to do. Like, you're there to be like a coach and a mentor and to help them grow and develop. And I think those are some of the best experiences when I've left these various places. It's not so much like the accomplishments of oh, I mean, it is and it isn't. Of course, I'm very
It's the
proud of
network. Yeah.
what
Yeah.
it's the network.
Yeah,
It's really the
Totally.
people and how you've impacted them and how they've impacted you as a leader as you kind of move through these different building stages.
Yeah. I think about that all the time because we at the council now have people who have reported to me, people I've reported to, skip levels, all
Right.
involved in different ways in what we're building. And I often just think how lucky am I that I was in that environment, that I came across all these people that, hey, I want to work with again in the future and they want to work with me again in the future. And I think just when you're in those high, super dynamic environments, that's the sort of thing that you remember for the next 5 to 10 years or maybe the rest of your life is who made the biggest impact while you were there and what you want to, and they're the person you want to call up when you're doing something exciting. So I think it's
Yeah.
great.
And you'll want to learn from them again, and
Mhm.
they'll want to learn from you again. So it's a
Totally.
constant type of ecosystem, basically.
Awesome. Well, Tina, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Where can people follow you or your work and learn more about Class Dojo?
Well, I have no social media presence, so and this
I
is
didn't
probably
realize
the
that.
toughest question. I am on LinkedIn, so if you wanna find me on LinkedIn, I'm Tina Hwang, Hwang. That's probably the best way to find me. And then, of course, find Class Dojo on LinkedIn too. We have a LinkedIn feed there where we talk about our upcoming launches and what's happening for schools and districts as well. And I repost some of the stuff on my LinkedIn as well. But thanks so much for having me. This has been a lot of
Yeah.
fun. And I feel
Yeah.
like this kind of just reinforces why I was drawn to you guys, that we have such similar sort of ethos in terms of building and thinking about how to build products for consumers and how to think about growing teams as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
completely. Yeah, it's exciting. I loved it. Was great to hear everything that you've kind of learned throughout your journey and that first builder experience over and over again. And it's funny how many first builders have mentioned the word masochist. So I'm sure there's something else
Common
behind
thread.
it. It's not that
Yeah,
flat,
it's a
but we'll
common
figure it
thread,
out.
basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well,
Awesome.
thank
Well,
you so
thank you
much for
so
coming
much.
on the show, and we're super excited to release this to our audience.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Rachel, what stood out to you from that conversation?
Well, it was so fun to hear about her experience, just like in these crazy scale companies. Not very many people get to do that, like, just one time,
Multiple
but she had
times.
it at Google, like
Yeah.
early days for almost a decade. Then she was at WhatsApp and then Twitter also at all of these inflection points.
Yeah.
So it's wild. And then now starting over at Class Dojo. But I really loved what she talked about trade-offs. I feel like that's something that we hear a lot from founders too. And at least I hear it a lot on the health tech side, just because people are often thinking about like the trade-offs, dealing with like things like healthcare data and privacy. And then also like, but then the potential that what you can, right? Like for the research side of things. So that was really interesting to hear her perspective on it from a consumer standpoint for WhatsApp and on a global scale. And then the other one, which I kept on being reminded of our conversation with Prashanthi, when Prashanthi talked a lot about how regulatory can really be a revenue driver and not just a revenue blocker. And so that just kept coming up as Tina was talking about how, legal is not really this blocker, but it can really be a way to enhance. And sometimes, I mean, it's a must have, especially in global context, but it can still be a way to enhance your growth as well. So.
Yeah, totally. And back to the trade-off thing that you mentioned, I think it seemed like in some ways every single time that those sort of trade-offs and governance came up, she was sort of tying ambiguity and turning it into a framework in some ways for the team. So almost like taking in
Yeah.
the issue, taking in their priorities, and then like mirroring back to them. Here's the framework in which I'm thinking about this, and we as a team should decide which box we want to be in and what sort of risk we're willing to take. Because it seems like almost every issue she's faced at every one of these companies has been in a gray area, which is probably true of a lot of lawyers in cutting edge technology or like semi-regulated industries. And so I like that, like sort of forcing oneself as a leader to turn something completely ambiguous into a framework. And that just helps the rest of the team understand what you're all agreeing to together. And again, like hold hands going forward. And then I loved all the conversations around trust. It just came up time after time after time in our conversation. And I think it extends, not only to just building trust with regulatory officials, but also with customers themselves, which we talked about, with AI right now. I think it's just so timely. And I think even beyond being trustworthy, just like designing a customer experience that is helpful all the way to the end, that where, there have been multiple companies where people start complaining about them online because they can't even like cancel their accounts right now. It's like companies are going to the like nth degree in terms of automation. You can't find an email address for the support team. You can't find a phone number to call anymore. And so you're relying on these like chat bots and everybody's like, we're using AI, it's fine. But then when you're actually the customer in that position, you're like, I sometimes like, if I'm going to talk to an AI bot, they need to be able to take action. Similar to Sienna, one of our portfolio companies, I know they're tackling that, but I think it's just so important for anybody building an AI right now to think about like, how are you really going to leave that customer feeling? And are you just putting off a bigger problem later by, being so cheap that you won't manage that customer experience at all? So I think that came up a couple of times with her, and I found that really interesting because I'm personally hoping that the pendulum swings in the other direction and that AI can enable it through companies like Sienna and not just be, or enable like the pendulum swinging rather than enable sort of just kind of like putting the customer off and being like, hey, don't talk to me. I'm going to make it really hard for you to get in touch with me.
Yeah. No, it's interesting that you talk about that because like I've been thinking a lot about like the human element in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's always all of these like AI doom and gloom type of articles coming out, right? And I guess like blog posts and things like that. And I do think that, yeah, like companies will do well to really think about like their end users and the human element and what like people are really looking for right now, which goes back again to that customer experience and trust.
Yep. Agreed.
Well, if you'd enjoyed this episode, make sure to leave us a review or share it with a friend and subscribe to First Builders wherever you get your podcasts because it's super helpful for us and ensures that more people can listen to it.
Yeah. And don't forget to subscribe to the Council newsletter for more founder stories and frameworks that you can apply to your own company.
Awesome. See you guys next time.